Before we begin, just a gentle reminder that if this kind of slow, slightly boring history helps you drift off, you can quietly subscribe and then immediately relax your shoulders again. Now, let's begin. When people imagine medieval royalty, they often picture gold crowns, dramatic banquets, and velvet-covered power. In reality, life for a medieval king or queen was mostly about endurance. For nearly 1,000 years, from the early Middle Ages to the late medieval period, royalty lived in a world that was cold, uncomfortable, and permanently stressful. Castles were not cozy homes. They were stone structures, designed for defense first and human comfort somewhere far down the list. Thick walls kept enemies out, but they also trapped moisture, cold air, and the smell of damp stone. Even the richest kings slept in rooms that rarely stayed warm through the night. Fires helped a little, but smoke, ash, and drafts usually won in the end. Beds were wooden frames with straw or feather mattresses, and sheets were changed far less often than modern people would tolerate. Royal sleep, despite the titles, was light, interrupted, and often shared with servants who slept nearby in case something went wrong, which it frequently did. A medieval monarch woke early, not because they wanted to, but because the castle did. Bells rang, servants moved, animals stirred in nearby courtyards, and privacy was almost non-existent. Breakfast was simple, usually bread and ale or wine, since water was unreliable. Even royalty avoided drinking plain water, unless they had no other choice. Hygiene was practical rather than luxurious. Bathing happened occasionally, not daily, and always with some concern about illness, drafts, or moral suspicion. Medical knowledge was limited, and royal physicians relied heavily on bloodletting, herbs, and confident guessing. Being born into a royal family did not protect you from disease. In fact, it often made things worse. Close living quarters, poor sanitation, and constant travel exposed royal families to infections that spread quickly and lingered. Child mortality was high, even among kings and queens. It was normal for a royal couple to have many children and expect only a few to survive into adulthood. Meals, while plentiful, were not necessarily pleasant. Meat was common, vegetables less so, and fresh fruit depended entirely on season and location. Food preservation relied on salt, smoke, and drying, which meant flavors were intense and textures often questionable. Banquets existed, yes, but they were political tools, not daily indulgences. Most meals were eaten with fingers, knives, and shared dishes. Table manners were developing slowly, and forks were still a novelty in many regions. Clothing looked impressive, but it was heavy, layered, and impractical. Royal garments were designed to display status, not comfort. Long robes dragged across dirty floors, and bright dyes came from expensive, sometimes toxic sources. Crowns themselves were heavy, awkward objects worn for ceremony rather than comfort, and even then only briefly. The real weight royalty carried was not on their heads, but in their responsibilities. A medieval king was expected to rule, judge, command armies, negotiate alliances, and produce heirs, all while avoiding assassination, rebellion, and divine punishment. Queens faced their own pressures, including constant childbirth, political marriages, and acting as living symbols of legitimacy. There was no retirement plan. A king ruled until death, deposition, or quiet removal by relatives who wanted the job. Power was never secure, and paranoia was a survival skill. This is the world we will slowly explore together. Not the dramatic version filled with shining armor, but the quieter, colder reality of medieval royalty, where even the most powerful people in society spent much of their lives tired, uncomfortable, and worried about tomorrow. And with that gently unsettling thought, we can continue drifting deeper into the long, slow history of medieval kings and queens. As we move further into this quiet timeline, it becomes clear that medieval royalty lived under a constant sense of watchfulness, both human and divine. Kings and queens believed deeply that their rule was sanctioned by God, which meant that every famine, plague, or military defeat felt like a personal moral failure rather than bad luck. This belief shaped daily decisions in subtle, exhausting ways. Religious observance was not optional. Royal schedules revolved around prayers, feast days, fasting periods, and long church services conducted in echoing stone chapels that were just as cold as the rest of the castle. Missing a holy day was not just impolite, It was dangerous to one's reputation and possibly to one's soul. Royal children were raised within this atmosphere of seriousness from the moment they could walk. Childhood, as we understand it now, barely existed. Princes and princesses were political assets first and people second. Education focused on obedience, lineage, and preparation for marriage or rule. Boys trained in warfare, governance, and religious doctrine, while girls learned court etiquette, household management, and how to appear calm while being traded into alliances they did not choose. Emotional attachment between parents and children was restrained, partly because of custom, and partly because experience taught that affection could be short-lived. Children died often enough that distance became a form of protection. Life inside the court was crowded and loud despite the formality. A medieval royal household could include hundreds of people: servants, guards, advisors, clergy, cooks, messengers, and guests who never seemed to leave. Privacy was rare, secrets were difficult to keep, and gossip moved faster than official announcements. Even a king was never truly alone. Conversations were overheard, letters intercepted, and loyalties constantly shifting. Trust was expensive, and mistakes were permanent. Travel added another layer of discomfort. Medieval royalty moved often, not for pleasure, but necessity. Castles needed maintenance, supplies ran out, and rulers were expected to be seen by their subjects. Roads were poor, journeys slow, and accommodations unpredictable. A royal procession meant weeks of planning, carts of supplies, and long days on horseback or in jolting wagons. Inns were unreliable, so royalty often stayed in monasteries or noble homes, which created both gratitude and tension. Everywhere the court went, it consumed resources and left behind debts, resentment, and exhaustion. War hovered constantly in the background, even during peaceful years. A medieval ruler was expected to lead armies, or at least appear capable of doing so. Armor was heavy, weapons required training, and battles were chaotic, frightening events with no guarantee of survival, regardless of status. Being captured could be worse than dying. Ransoms were expensive, negotiations humiliating, and captivity uncertain. Victory brought temporary relief, but never rest. There was always another rival, another border, another claim to the throne. Queens lived with a different kind of danger. Childbirth was one of the most lethal experiences in medieval life, even for royalty. Medical care offered little help beyond prayers and tradition. A successful birth was celebrated not just emotionally, but politically. A failed one could destabilize an entire kingdom. Queens were expected to produce heirs calmly, repeatedly, and without complaint, while also representing grace, virtue, and stability. Their influence was often subtle, exercised through letters, patronage, and carefully chosen words rather than open authority. When things went wrong, queens were convenient targets for blame. As centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell in patterns that now seem predictable but felt terrifying in the moment. Names repeated, crowns changed hands, and castles passed from family to family with surprising speed. Time moved slowly day to day, yet brutally fast across generations. Medieval royalty lived inside that contradiction, trying to control a world that refused to stay still. And as we continue, drifting deeper into this long stretch of uneasy power, we begin to see that ruling for 1,000 years was not a story of comfort or glamour, but one of constant adjustment, quiet fear, and endurance carried out under stone ceilings and heavy expectations. By the time medieval royalty reached the middle centuries of this long era, power had become something both familiar and deeply unstable. Kings and queens inherited traditions, but they also inherited unresolved problems that quietly waited for the wrong moment to surface. Law, for example, was less a fixed system and more a collection of customs, personal judgments, and local expectations. A medieval king was the highest judge in the land, which meant that disputes large and small eventually reached the throne. Some cases involved land, taxes, or noble feuds that had lasted longer than anyone remembered. Others were painfully personal, involving accusations of treason, disloyalty, or improper behavior. Decisions were rarely clear. Whatever choice a ruler made, someone powerful would be disappointed, offended, or quietly plotting revenge. Justice was not blind. It was political, emotional, and often influenced by who was standing closest to the throne at that moment. This constant need to judge others added a slow, grinding pressure to daily life. Royal councils met frequently, sometimes daily, filling rooms with murmured arguments, cautious advice, and carefully phrased warnings. Advisors mattered enormously. A wise counselor could stabilize a kingdom, while a reckless one could destroy it. Yet kings and queens had no reliable way to measure wisdom in advance. Loyalty shifted, flattery disguised, ambition, and betrayal often arrived wearing familiar faces. Trust was never complete. Even marriages, the most visible symbols of alliance, were fragile. Medieval royal marriages were contracts before they were relationships. Spouses were chosen for land, influence, or peace treaties rather than affection. Many couples barely knew each other before the ceremony. Some never learned to trust one another afterward. Language barriers, cultural differences, and competing loyalties made intimacy difficult. Yet these marriages were watched constantly by the court. Every interaction, every argument, and every moment of closeness was noted and interpreted for political meaning. Silence could be seen as hostility. Warmth could be viewed as manipulation. Even boredom had consequences. Time itself moved strangely for medieval royalty. Days were long and repetitive, structured around meals, prayers, audiences, and administrative tasks. There were no weekends, no true holidays, only variations in obligation. Feast days brought temporary noise and excess, but they also required planning, performance, and expense. The aftermath was often exhaustion and cleanup rather than rest. Nightfall did not bring peace. Candlelight limited activity, but worries did not fade with the dark. Concerns about succession, finances, alliances, and health lingered quietly in the mind. Many rulers slept poorly, waking often, listening for unfamiliar sounds, aware that history offered plenty of examples of kings who never woke at all. Illness was another constant companion. Medieval medicine lacked understanding of infection, nutrition, or long-term disease management. A simple wound could become fatal. Fevers were mysterious and frightening. Treatments were uncomfortable at best and harmful at worst. Bloodletting, purging, and questionable remedies were common, even for royalty. Chronic pain was endured silently, as admitting weakness could invite political danger. Aging rulers faced a particularly uncomfortable transition. Authority depended on strength, presence, and the perception of control. As bodies weakened, rivals grew bolder. A king who lingered too long in illness risked becoming a symbol of decline rather than stability. Queens who aged out of childbearing years often lost influence, replaced quietly by younger women at court who attracted attention and power. The court itself aged unevenly, with traditions surviving long after the people who created them were gone. Clothing styles, ceremonies, and etiquette accumulated layers of meaning over centuries, turning daily life into a performance of inherited habits. Medieval royalty lived surrounded by reminders of the past, portraits of ancestors, tombs in cathedral floors, family names repeated endlessly. History was not distant. It was present in every hall and every expectation. The weight of lineage pressed down gently but constantly, shaping decisions in ways that felt unavoidable. To rule was to carry not only the present, but the memory of everything that had come before. And as the centuries continued to unfold, kings and queens learned, slowly and often painfully, that power was not something you possessed comfortably. It was something you held briefly, carefully, and always with the understanding that it would eventually pass on to someone else, leaving behind only stone walls, written records, and the quiet traces of a life spent ruling rather than resting. As medieval centuries drifted forward, the idea of legacy began to quietly dominate royal thinking, sometimes more than the present itself. Kings and queens ruled with one eye on the future they would never see, carefully shaping laws, marriages, and construction projects meant to outlive them. Castles were expanded not because they were comfortable, but because permanence mattered. Stone was a statement. A tower said stability, even if the rooms inside remained damp and cold. Cathedrals rose slowly, over decades and sometimes centuries, funded by royal patronage as acts of faith, power, and reputation. A ruler might commission a structure knowing full well they would be buried long before its completion, yet the act itself was comforting. It suggested continuity in a world that rarely offered it. Money, however, was a constant problem. Medieval kingdoms did not run on steady income. Taxes were irregular, difficult to collect, and deeply unpopular. Royal treasuries fluctuated wildly depending on harvests, wars, and the cooperation of nobles who preferred to keep their wealth close. Kings frequently lived on the edge of debt, borrowing from merchants, religious institutions, or foreign powers. Financial stress shaped policy quietly but decisively. Wars were delayed or rushed based on available funds. Marriages were arranged to solve budget problems disguised as alliances. Even royal wardrobes were sometimes reused and repaired rather than replaced, despite appearances. Wealth existed, but it was fragile. Administration required attention to detail that most people never associate with medieval royalty. Documents were handwritten, copied slowly, and prone to error. Messengers traveled at the mercy of weather, bandits, and poor roads. Information arrived late and often incomplete. A king might make a decision based on news that was weeks old by the time it reached him. Mistakes were inevitable. Once made, they were difficult to correct. Orders could not be undone quickly, and misunderstandings spread easily. This created a style of rule that favored caution and repetition. Change happened slowly, not because rulers lacked imagination, but because the system resisted speed. The court, meanwhile, continued its quiet performance. Ceremonies repeated endlessly, reinforcing hierarchy through ritual rather than explanation. Who stood where, who spoke first, and who sat closest to the throne all mattered deeply. These details communicated power without words. A misplaced gesture could be interpreted as an insult. A delayed invitation could signal a shift in favor. Court life required constant attention to small signals, which drained energy in subtle ways. Even rest was strategic. A king who appeared too relaxed risked seeming weak. One who appeared too tense risked alarming allies. Balance was everything, and balance was exhausting. The role of rumor grew steadily more influential as populations expanded and literacy remained limited. Stories traveled faster than facts. A whispered accusation could do more damage than an actual rebellion if left unaddressed. Royal responses to rumor were careful and often indirect. Public appearances, generous gifts, or symbolic punishments were used to counter narratives without acknowledging them openly. Silence was a tool, but a dangerous one. Say too little, and others would fill the gap. Say too much, and you revealed insecurity. Royal women, especially queens and regents, navigated this environment with particular care. Their authority was often questioned, conditional, or quietly undermined. To rule effectively, many learned to work through intermediaries, influence appointments, and manage households as political spaces. Their power rarely appeared in official records, but it shaped outcomes nonetheless. The private chambers of a queen were not retreats. They were centers of discussion, negotiation, and careful listening. Aging remained unavoidable. As years passed, rulers faced the gradual narrowing of their world. Travel became more difficult. Illness lingered longer. Advisors took on greater responsibility, sometimes helpfully, sometimes opportunistically. The court watched closely for signs of decline. A slow walk, a trembling hand, or a missed name could shift loyalties overnight. Succession planning became urgent, but delicate. Naming an heir too early risked encouraging ambition. Waiting too long invited uncertainty. Death itself was rarely sudden and peaceful. Medieval rulers often endured long final illnesses, surrounded by clergy, advisors, and relatives already preparing for what came next. The body faded, while the institution moved forward. Funerals were elaborate, designed to project stability at the moment of greatest vulnerability. Even grief followed protocol. And so medieval royalty passed through time, generation by generation, carrying forward habits, fears, and expectations they did not invent but could not escape. Their lives were not grand adventures unfolding dramatically, but slow accumulations of duty, anxiety, and routine. Power did not roar. It murmured, echoed through stone corridors, and eventually fell quiet, leaving behind names carved into tombs and histories written carefully enough to last just long enough for us to read them, slowly. As we drift further into this long, patient past, as medieval royalty continued to move through these long centuries, the relationship between ruler and subject became increasingly distant. even as it was constantly emphasized. Kings and queens were expected to be seen, but not touched, known, but not familiar. Public appearances were carefully staged events, designed to remind people of authority rather than create connection. A royal procession through a town brought color, noise, and ceremony, but it also brought anxiety. Towns were expected to host the court, provide food, lodging, and entertainment, and do so without complaint. For the people watching from the edges of the crowd, royalty appeared briefly, elevated and unreachable, before moving on again. For the rulers themselves, these appearances were exhausting performances repeated endlessly, each one carrying the risk of offense, misinterpretation, or unrest. Silence from the crowd could be read as respect or resentment. Cheers could be sincere or cautious. Nothing was simple. Inside the palace walls, time continued its slow routine. Documents accumulated, disputes resurfaced. The same names appeared again and again in petitions and complaints, creating the sense that problems were never fully solved, only temporarily managed. Royal attention was a limited resource. Choosing what to address personally and what to delegate was a constant balancing act. Delegate too much, and authority slipped away. Handle too much alone, and exhaustion followed. Many rulers aged quickly under this pressure, their physical decline reflecting years of uninterrupted responsibility. Leisure existed, but it was carefully controlled. Hunting was one of the few acceptable forms of relaxation, valued not only for enjoyment, but for its symbolic connection to control and dominance. Music, poetry, and storytelling were encouraged at court, though often with moral or political undertones. Laughter was permitted, but rarely spontaneous. Even entertainment carried expectations of dignity. Festivals offered moments of release, yet they also reinforced hierarchy. Everyone knew their place, even while celebrating. Seasons mattered deeply. Winter was endured rather than enjoyed. Cold slowed movement, increased illness, and amplified discomfort within stone buildings that never fully warmed. Supplies dwindled, tempers shortened, and fear of scarcity quietly crept into conversations. Spring brought relief but also uncertainty, as harvest outcomes were still months away. Weather shaped mood and policy alike. A bad year could undo careful planning and destabilize an otherwise steady reign. Religion continued to frame understanding of these cycles. Success was interpreted as favor, failure as warning. Rulers donated to churches, commissioned masses, and sought reassurance through ritual, hoping to align themselves with forces they could not control. Fear of divine judgment existed alongside fear of human rebellion. Both felt equally real. The body itself remained an unreliable companion. Toothaches, joint pain, and lingering infections were common and untreated by modern standards. Chronic discomfort was accepted as part of life, rarely discussed openly. Admitting pain suggested weakness, and weakness invited challenge. Stoicism was not admired for its own sake. It was necessary for survival. As new generations took the throne, they inherited not only crowns and lands, but the accumulated habits of restraint and vigilance. Each ruler promised stability, yet quietly faced the same pressures as those before them. Change came slowly, often unnoticed until decades later, when historians would name periods and assign meaning. For those living through it, medieval royalty was not an era of dramatic transformation, but a long, continuous effort to maintain balance in a world that resisted it. And as this effort repeated itself year after year, ruler after ruler, the rhythm of medieval power settled into something steady, heavy, and predictable. A life of responsibility measured not in moments of triumph, but in days survived without collapse. A life that moved forward patiently, quietly, and without hurry, much like the history we are following now, one slow step at a time toward rest. As medieval royalty settled into this steady rhythm of obligation, the idea of personal identity slowly faded behind the role itself. A king was rarely allowed to simply be a person. From the moment of coronation, individuality became secondary to symbolism. Clothing, speech, posture, and even facial expressions were shaped by expectation. A careless comment could be interpreted as policy. A private frustration could become public rumor. Over time, many rulers learned to speak cautiously, saying much while revealing little, mastering the art of controlled ambiguity. This restraint followed them everywhere, including into moments that should have been private. Grief, for example, was never entirely personal. When a royal family member died, mourning became a public act, regulated by custom and observed closely. The length of mourning, the color of clothing, and the timing of a return to public life all carried political meaning. To mourn too long suggested instability. To mourn too briefly suggested cruelty. Emotion was allowed, but only within narrow, carefully measured limits. Celebration followed similar rules. A successful treaty or marriage alliance brought feasts and pageantry, but even joy was expected to appear dignified. Excessive enthusiasm could be seen as poor judgment or insecurity. Moderation, whether genuine or performed, was considered a sign of fitness to rule. This constant regulation of feeling created a quiet emotional distance between rulers and their own experiences. Many learned to observe their lives rather than fully inhabit them. Education reinforced this distance. Medieval royal children were trained early to suppress impulse and accept hierarchy. Lessons emphasized memory, repetition, and obedience rather than creativity. History was taught as a chain of examples to follow or avoid, filled with cautionary tales of rulers who spoke too freely, trusted too openly, or acted too quickly. The past functioned as instruction rather than inspiration. Even leisure reading, when available, focused on moral lessons and religious reflection. The inner world was meant to be orderly, controlled, and useful. Court relationships reflected this same pattern. Friendships were rare and risky. A close companion could become a liability if political winds shifted. Many rulers surrounded themselves with familiar faces, yet kept an emotional distance that prevented true intimacy. Loneliness was common, though rarely acknowledged. Silence filled the spaces where modern conversation might have offered comfort. Letters became an important outlet, carefully written and preserved, allowing rulers to express concern or affection at a safe distance. Still, even written words were cautious. Paper lasted longer than trust. As years passed, the physical spaces of rule began to feel smaller. Corridors repeated themselves. Chambers changed little. Walls remembered more than the people within them. A ruler might walk the same path through a castle thousands of times, watching servants age, children grow, and advisors disappear one by one. Familiarity bred not comfort, but awareness of time passing. This awareness shaped decision-making in subtle ways. Older rulers tended to favor preservation over ambition, choosing stability rather than expansion. Younger ones often promised renewal, only to slowly adopt the same caution as responsibility accumulated. The cycle repeated with remarkable consistency. Death remained the only true interruption. Even then, the transition was designed to appear seamless. Authority passed quickly, ceremonies followed established patterns, and life within the court resumed its measured pace. The institution absorbed loss and continued forward. Individual lives ended quietly, folded into records and memory. Medieval royalty did not seek peace in stillness. Stillness made room for doubt. Instead, they moved steadily, filling time with ritual, obligation, and controlled activity. It was a way to endure rather than escape. And so the centuries continued, marked not by sudden change, but by repetition softened by habit. A long, unbroken line of rulers living carefully, speaking slowly, and carrying the same weight forward, generation after generation, until even the burden itself began to feel familiar enough to rest beside, if not entirely set down. As the medieval world continued its slow, unhurried turning, the distance between royal authority and everyday reality quietly widened. Kings and queens ruled over lands they rarely saw and people they never met, relying on layers of messengers, local lords, and written reports that filtered reality into something manageable and often misleading. A rebellion might appear on parchment as a minor disturbance, while on the ground it felt like chaos and fear. A peaceful region could be described in glowing terms, masking resentment that simply had not yet found a voice. Royalty lived inside this softened version of the world, where danger was sometimes delayed by distance and comforted by abstraction. Decisions were made in chambers far removed from their consequences, which did not make those decisions easier, only quieter. This separation shaped how rulers understood responsibility. Guilt existed, but it was muted, spread thin across vast territories and countless lives. To dwell on it too long would have been paralyzing. Instead, Responsibility became procedural. Orders were issued, prayers were said, and outcomes were accepted as part of a larger, often unknowable design. Communication itself was an exercise in patience. Letters took weeks to arrive, replies took weeks more, and situations changed in the meantime. A king might respond carefully to a problem that had already resolved itself or worsened beyond recognition. This delay encouraged caution and reinforced the belief that sudden action was dangerous. Stability, even imperfect stability, was preferable to bold correction. Time dulled urgency. Within the court, generations overlapped in subtle ways. Elderly advisors carried memories of earlier reigns, quietly comparing present rulers to past ones, sometimes favorably, often not. Young nobles arrived eager, confident, and unaware of how quickly enthusiasm faded under responsibility. The court absorbed them all, smoothing sharp edges through routine. Ambition softened into habit. Idealism turned into careful language. Even rebellion, when it occurred, followed familiar patterns. Claims were made, banners raised, alliances tested, and eventually settled through force or negotiation. Nothing about it felt new to those who had seen it before. Royal identity continued to rely heavily on lineage. Names repeated across centuries, creating a sense of continuity that was comforting and oppressive at the same time. A ruler was never just themselves. They were an echo of those who came before, expected to resemble them closely enough to feel legitimate, yet differed just enough to appear capable. Portraits and symbols reinforced this continuity, reminding everyone, including the ruler, that individuality was temporary while the crown endured. Memory within royal families was selective. Victories were celebrated, failures quietly reframed or forgotten. History was curated long before historians arrived to study it. This curation offered emotional protection. To remember every mistake clearly would have been unbearable. Aging brought with it a narrowing of ambition. Dreams of reform or conquest faded into concerns about succession, peace, and legacy. Many rulers reached a point where survival itself felt like success. Days passed quietly, filled with familiar rituals and predictable concerns. The urgency of youth gave way to endurance. At that stage, the crown felt less like a symbol of power and more like a companion that could not be set aside. It was always present, even in moments of illness, fatigue, or reflection. And so, medieval royalty continued to exist within this slow-moving structure, neither entirely in control nor entirely powerless. They ruled not through dramatic gestures, but through persistence, through repetition, through the quiet acceptance that history did not move quickly, and neither could they. Their lives unfolded at the same measured pace as the centuries themselves, steady, restrained, and endlessly patient, inviting us to slow down alongside them and perhaps rest for a moment within that long, unhurried passing of time. As these centuries carried on, medieval royalty developed a quiet familiarity with disappointment. Expectations were set carefully, rarely met fully, and adjusted downward with experience. Promises made at coronations softened over time into intentions, then into traditions, and finally into stories told long after the moment had passed. A new ruler often arrived with plans for reform, justice, or renewal, speaking earnestly of order and improvement. Yet the structure they inherited resisted enthusiasm. Customs were older than memory, privileges deeply embedded, and resistance polite but firm. Nobles listened patiently, agreed publicly, and continued privately as before. Over time, rulers learned that lasting change was not dramatic. It crept forward slowly, hidden inside minor adjustments and quiet compromises. This understanding brought a kind of calm resignation. Ambition did not disappear, but it learned to move carefully, as if not to wake something larger and more dangerous. Daily life reflected this moderation. Meals followed routine. Audiences followed protocol. Decisions followed precedent. Even conflict became familiar, unfolding in patterns that felt strangely predictable. A tax dispute followed a known rhythm. A border disagreement came with expected arguments. The court recognized these shapes and responded accordingly. There was comfort in predictability, even when the outcomes were unpleasant. Uncertainty was more exhausting than hardship. The passing of time became most noticeable through absence. A chair remained empty after an advisor's death. A familiar voice no longer spoke during council. Servants aged quietly, replaced by younger ones who learned the same routines without comment. Life continued without pause, absorbing loss as it went. Royalty learned not to linger too long on what was gone. Memory existed, but it was controlled. Excessive nostalgia was considered indulgent. The future required attention, even if it looked much like the past. Communication within families remained formal. Parents and children spoke with affection shaped by hierarchy. Praise was measured. Disapproval was indirect. Love existed, but it wore layers of expectation. Letters carried warmth that spoken words often avoided, allowing feelings to travel safely across distance and decorum. Marriage continued to function as strategy first and companionship second. Some unions grew comfortable over time, settling into mutual understanding rather than romance. Others remained distant, polite arrangements sustained by necessity. Both were accepted as normal. Emotional fulfillment was not considered essential to a successful reign. Stability mattered more. Faith continued to offer structure where certainty was lacking. Prayer provided language for fear and hope alike. Ritual offered rhythm when outcomes felt beyond control. Confession allowed for private acknowledgement of doubt without public weakness. Even rulers who questioned privately often participated fully, understanding the comfort religion provided not just to themselves, but to the people they governed. Belief and performance overlapped in ways that were rarely examined too closely. Toward the later medieval centuries, subtle shifts began to appear. Trade expanded, towns grew louder, money moved more quickly. Information, while still slow, traveled farther. These changes did not immediately transform royal life, but they introduced a faint sense of movement beneath the familiar stillness. Courts adapted cautiously, incorporating new practices without abandoning old ones. Change was tolerated only when it arrived quietly. Through all of this, medieval royalty remained largely the same in spirit, cautious, observant, and shaped by repetition. Their lives were not defined by singular dramatic moments, but by the accumulation of small decisions made day after day. Decisions that rarely felt heroic, often felt tiring, and almost always felt necessary. And as this long pattern continued, it carried both ruler and kingdom forward together, slowly, steadily, and without hurry, as if time itself had agreed to move gently, allowing everyone within it to simply continue, one measured breath at a time. As medieval royalty moved deeper into this long, uneven stretch of time, familiarity with uncertainty became a kind of background condition, like the cold stone beneath their feet. Rulers learned not to expect clarity. Information arrived incomplete, intentions were rarely transparent, and outcomes often surprised even those who had planned most carefully. Rather than seeking certainty, kings and queens learned to manage ambiguity. Decisions were framed broadly, leaving room for interpretation. Promises were phrased cautiously, allowing adjustment without open contradiction. This flexibility was not weakness, it was survival. The court understood this language well, reading between lines and responding in kind. Silence often meant deliberation rather than indecision. Delay signaled caution rather than neglect. Over time, everyone involved learned to move within these unspoken rules, maintaining balance through mutual restraint. The physical environment reinforced this mindset. Castles aged alongside their occupants. Stones cracked, wood warped, tapestries faded. Repairs were constant, yet never complete. The sense that everything required ongoing maintenance became deeply ingrained. Rule itself felt similar. There was no final state of order, only continued effort. Even peace was temporary, a pause between demands rather than a lasting condition. This awareness softened expectations. Triumphs were enjoyed briefly, then set aside in preparation for what followed. Failure, while painful, was rarely shocking. It was absorbed into the rhythm of rule. Education within royal households reflected this realism. Younger generations were taught to observe carefully, speak little, and endure discomfort without complaint. Stories of past rulers emphasized patience more than brilliance, caution more than courage. The lesson was subtle but clear. Longevity mattered more than greatness. To rule for many years without collapse was considered an achievement in itself. As rulers aged, reflection replaced ambition. The future narrowed into concerns about transition rather than expansion. Attention shifted toward heirs, advisors, and the careful arrangement of responsibilities. Documents were reviewed, titles confirmed, and loyalties quietly reinforced. The act of preparing for departure became its own form of rule. Even then, uncertainty remained. Plans could be undone by sudden illness, political shifts, or unexpected deaths. Acceptance of this fragility became part of the role. Royalty learned to live with the knowledge that control was always partial. That understanding brought a quiet humility, rarely spoken aloud, but deeply felt. The crown did not promise mastery over events, only responsibility within them. This realization softened the sharp edges of authority, replacing certainty with patience. And so, medieval royalty continued, not driven by confidence, but carried forward by endurance. Their lives unfolded without clear resolution, shaped by repetition, limitation, and careful persistence. In that slow unfolding, history did not rush. It settled gently, layer by layer, leaving behind a record of people who ruled not because they were certain, but because they continued. And in that continuation, steady and unremarkable, the medieval world found its lasting shape, quiet enough to fade into rest, one unhurried moment after another. As medieval royalty approached the later stages of this long historical stretch, repetition became so familiar that it almost faded into the background of daily awareness. Rulers woke, governed, and rested within patterns so well established that deviation felt uncomfortable rather than exciting. Change, when it occurred, was usually framed as restoration rather than innovation. New policies were presented as returns to older, purer traditions, even when they were quietly new. This language reassured both ruler and subject, suggesting continuity instead of disruption. The medieval world valued stability so deeply that novelty had to disguise itself as memory. Authority rested not on originality, but on resemblance to what had already been accepted. This preference shaped how power aged. A long-reigning monarch became less a figure of command and more a fixture of the landscape, like a tower that had always been there. Their presence offered reassurance simply by continuing. Absence, rather than action, became the greatest concern. When a ruler grew ill or withdrew from public view, uncertainty spread quickly. The court adjusted its tone, speaking more softly, watching more closely. Decisions slowed. Everyone waited, aware that the smallest change in health could alter everything. Aging rulers were treated with a careful blend of respect and distance. Advisors spoke gently, rarely contradicting directly, offering suggestions wrapped in agreement. Disagreement, when necessary, was delayed or redirected. Time itself seemed to stretch in these moments, filled with anticipation rather than movement. Memory played an increasingly selective role. Later years encouraged reflection, but not confession. Rulers remembered victories with clarity, failures with restraint, and regrets mostly in silence. What mattered most was not honesty, but coherence. A reign was expected to make sense when viewed as a whole, even if the lived experience felt fragmented and uncertain. This expectation shaped how events were recorded, how stories were told, and how lessons were passed down. Chroniclers emphasized order and purpose, smoothing over hesitation and contradiction. The messy reality of decision-making rarely survived intact. Instead, history was given structure after the fact, offering comfort to those who came later. Within this carefully shaped memory, medieval royalty became symbols as much as individuals. Their personal doubts, fatigue, and quiet disappointments dissolved into broader narratives of rule and continuity. Life within the court continued its measured pace, even as awareness of endings grew stronger. Preparations for death were practical rather than dramatic. Arrangements were made quietly, documents sealed, instructions given with careful language. The future was addressed calmly, as if distance itself offered reassurance. Even at the end, control was partial. Final moments were shaped as much by circumstance as intention. Yet the institution absorbed each passing without pause. A death did not stop the machinery of rule. Bells rang, ceremonies followed, and authority transferred smoothly, at least on the surface. The world outside continued to turn, largely indifferent to the individual who had just disappeared from its center. Medieval royalty understood this better than anyone. Their lives were spent maintaining something larger than themselves, knowing that one day it would continue without them. That knowledge did not bring peace, but it did bring acceptance. And so, as these long centuries continued their steady movement, Rulers lived not in pursuit of resolution, but in quiet coexistence with uncertainty. Their days passed slowly, predictably, and without urgency, leaving behind not dramatic endings, but gentle transitions, carried forward by time itself, patient and untroubled, inviting us to rest alongside it as the story continues. As medieval royalty continued through these later centuries, the concept of authority became increasingly ceremonial, layered with habit and expectation rather than constant action. Much of a ruler's influence now came from presence alone, simply being seen, seated on the throne, listening patiently, and responding predictably, was often enough to maintain order. Sudden gestures or dramatic decisions were viewed with suspicion. Calm repetition reassured everyone involved. The court functioned like a well-worn mechanism, its parts moving smoothly as long as nothing unexpected interfered. Rulers learned to respect this inertia. To push too hard against it was to risk disruption. Instead, they worked within it, guiding rather than forcing. This approach shaped daily behavior. Meetings followed familiar structures. Language softened with age. Commands sounded more like requests, and requests carried the weight of commands. Authority no longer needed volume. It existed quietly, understood by all who depended on it. Even punishment followed predictable forms. Justice was displayed carefully, not to shock, but to remind. Excessive cruelty unsettled the court, while excessive mercy suggested weakness. Balance remained the guiding principle. The physical world echoed this steadiness. Palaces were furnished with objects chosen for durability rather than beauty alone. Items were repaired, reused, and passed down. Nothing felt temporary. This permanence influenced thought. Rulers planned slowly, thinking in terms of years rather than moments. Impatience faded with experience. There was little reward in urgency when everything moved at the same deliberate pace. Personal desires adjusted accordingly. Dreams narrowed into manageable expectations. Comfort was found not in excitement, but in predictability. Familiar corridors, familiar faces, familiar problems returning in slightly altered forms. Even conflict lost some of its sharpness. Disputes arose, negotiations followed, and resolutions settled in gradually. The cycle was known. Fear diminished, replaced by cautious acceptance. Faith continued to provide structure, but belief often softened into routine. Ritual mattered more than reflection. Participation itself became reassuring. A ruler might kneel in prayer, less out of desperation and more out of habit, finding comfort in the familiar gestures rather than specific answers. Over time, belief blended with duty so thoroughly that separating the two felt unnecessary. This blending extended to identity itself. To rule was no longer something one did, but something one was, quietly and continuously. The idea of an alternative life faded from relevance. Medieval royalty rarely imagined escape. There was nowhere to go, and no version of themselves outside the role that felt real. The crown shaped posture, thought, and expectation until it became indistinguishable from the person beneath it. When fatigue arrived, it was endured without comment. When satisfaction appeared, it passed quickly, unremarked. Life settled into a steady flow of obligations met and days completed. And so the long medieval era continued, guided not by brilliance or transformation, but by consistency. Kings and queens ruled by remaining present, repeating what had worked and avoiding what had failed before. Their story advanced slowly, without urgency, carried forward by habit rather than intention. A history not of sudden change, but of quiet continuation, steady enough to follow without effort, and calm enough to let the mind drift, gently, as the centuries move on. As medieval royalty moved toward the final centuries of this long period, awareness of change became more noticeable, though rarely urgent. The world beyond the court grew busier, louder, and slightly more complex. Yet the rhythm inside royal walls remained mostly unchanged. Trade increased, towns expanded, and new ideas circulated slowly through universities and religious institutions. But these developments arrived at court in softened form, filtered through tradition and caution. Kings and queens acknowledged novelty politely, then folded it carefully into existing structures. Innovation was tolerated only when it could be made to look familiar. This habit of careful absorption preserved stability, but it also created distance. The court increasingly felt like a place slightly out of step with the wider world. insulated by ceremony and precedent. Royalty sensed this, even if they rarely spoke of it. Their authority still held, but it required more explanation, more symbols, more reassurance than before. Law grew more written, more detailed, and more bureaucratic. Decisions that once relied on personal judgment now required documents, seals, and witnesses. This reduced uncertainty in some ways, but added layers of delay and formality. Rulers spent more time reviewing papers and less time acting directly. Power became quieter, expressed through ink rather than voice. The crown still mattered, but it shared space with systems that could continue functioning even when the ruler was absent. This subtle shift changed how authority felt. It became less immediate, more distant, and slightly less personal. Within royal families, education reflected these changes. Children learned reading, writing, and arithmetic alongside tradition and faith. Practical knowledge gained value, though always framed as service to the crown rather than personal growth. Queens, in particular, found new forms of influence through correspondence and patronage, shaping policy indirectly by supporting scholars, clerics, and institutions that aligned with their interests. Their power remained quiet, but it expanded sideways rather than upward. Aging, rulers observed these shifts with mixed feelings. Some welcomed the order and predictability that bureaucracy provided. Others felt diminished by it, sensing that authority was no longer centered entirely in their person, yet resistance was rare. Change arrived gradually, leaving little reason to object openly. As always, adaptation felt safer than confrontation. The court adjusted its habits, adding new routines without abandoning old ones. Ritual expanded rather than disappeared. Tradition absorbed novelty until the two were nearly indistinguishable. Life continued its steady pace. Days passed filled with familiar obligations, now accompanied by more writing, more waiting, and more quiet administration. The emotional landscape remained much the same. Fatigue was constant, satisfaction was brief. Purpose was inherited rather than chosen. Medieval royalty lived within this evolving stillness, aware that the world was shifting, yet moving slowly enough that it never demanded sudden change. Their lives remained structured, predictable, and restrained. Power still rested on continuity, even as its form softened and spread. And so the medieval era approached its close not with a clear ending, but with a gradual thinning of certainty, a quiet rearrangement of authority, and a continued commitment to endurance over excitement. The crown remained, heavy and familiar, resting where it always had, even as the world beneath it moved forward, patiently and without haste, carrying everyone along together toward whatever came next. As the medieval era slowly approached its final stretch, medieval royalty found themselves living in a world that felt both familiar and slightly unfamiliar at the same time. The rules were still there, the rituals still repeated, and the crown still carried weight, yet the certainty that once surrounded authority had thinned, almost imperceptibly. Rulers continued to perform their duties with the same careful restraint, but they were increasingly aware that obedience now relied more on agreement than fear. Power still existed, but it required maintenance through explanation, negotiation, and reassurance. This awareness did not produce panic. It produced caution. Kings and queens adjusted their tone, speaking more deliberately, listening longer, and allowing processes to unfold rather than forcing outcomes. The court grew quieter in its confidence and more attentive to detail. Small gestures mattered more than grand declarations. The appearance of fairness became as important as fairness itself. Public ceremonies emphasized continuity, stability, and legitimacy, reinforcing the idea that nothing essential had changed, even as subtle shifts continued beneath the surface. Daily life remained repetitive and structured. Meals followed routine. Councils met at expected hours. Correspondence expanded, filling rooms with parchment and seals. The act of ruling became increasingly administrative, yet still personal enough to feel burdensome. Rulers spent long hours reading, reviewing, and approving, their authority expressed through careful endorsement rather than direct command. Fatigue accumulated quietly. There were no dramatic breakdowns, only a steady wearing down that came from years of responsibility without pause. Within royal families, expectations remained unchanged. Heirs were prepared methodically, taught patience rather than ambition, endurance rather than brilliance. Success was defined narrowly as continuity. To inherit smoothly, to rule without disruption, and to pass authority on intact was considered the highest achievement. Anything more was unnecessary risk. This mindset shaped how history was lived, even before it was written. The past continued to function as instruction. Examples were cited, precedents repeated. Innovation remained something to be approached indirectly or avoided altogether. Meanwhile, the world outside the court continued its gradual movement. Towns grew, trade routes expanded, and ideas circulated more freely. Yet these developments touched royalty gently, filtered through layers of advisors and tradition. The court absorbed them slowly, choosing familiarity whenever possible. Change was never rejected outright, but it was never rushed. There was comfort in delay. Time itself remained the most trusted ally. As rulers aged, their focus narrowed further. The future became a matter of succession rather than transformation. Attention turned inward, toward preparation rather than ambition. Documents were finalized, instructions clarified, loose ends quietly tied. Even the anticipation of death was handled with calm practicality. Nothing about the end was meant to surprise. The institution required continuity, and individuals adjusted themselves accordingly. Medieval royalty lived with the understanding that their personal desires mattered less than the smooth passage of authority. That understanding shaped every choice, every silence, and every careful decision. Their lives unfolded without urgency, guided by habit and moderated by caution. And so, as the medieval centuries drew closer to their quiet conclusion, royalty continued to rule not with drama or certainty, but with patience. A patience built from repetition, restraint, and acceptance. A patience that allowed the long story of medieval power to continue gently forward, unbroken, unhurried, and calm enough to rest within as we move onward, slowly, into what remains of this long and very tired history. As the medieval centuries eased toward their final years, medieval royalty began to sense that permanence was no longer guaranteed. Even if the rituals continued unchanged, the crown still rested on familiar heads. The ceremonies still unfolded in the same measured order, and the language of authority remained intact. Yet beneath it all lay a quiet awareness that the world was becoming less predictable. This awareness did not arrive suddenly. It settled slowly, like dust, barely noticeable until it had already covered everything. Rulers continued to govern as they always had, but their confidence now leaned more heavily on procedure than on presence. Councils grew larger, documents thicker, and decisions more carefully justified. Authority was increasingly shared with institutions that could outlast any single reign. This shift did not weaken royalty immediately, but it changed its texture. Power felt less personal, more distributed, and slightly harder to grasp. Kings and queens adapted by becoming more cautious, more deliberate, and more patient. Daily life reflected this adjustment. Mornings passed in review rather than command. Afternoons dissolved into discussion rather than decree. Evenings arrived quietly, carrying fatigue rather than satisfaction. There was little sense of accomplishment, only the steady relief of having endured another day without disruption. The court continued to value calm above all else. Sudden emotion, whether anger or enthusiasm, was discouraged. Stability depended on restraint, and restraint had become second nature. Relationships within the court grew increasingly formal. Familiarity gave way to distance. As roles hardened and expectations narrowed, trust remained limited, carefully rationed, and easily withdrawn. Within royal families, continuity remained the central concern. Heirs were prepared to maintain rather than transform, to preserve rather than expand. Education emphasized history, law, and tradition, reinforcing the idea that the future was safest when it closely resembled the past. Innovation, when necessary, was introduced quietly, framed as refinement rather than change. Aging rulers observed these preparations with a mix of relief and resignation. The burden they had carried would soon pass on, unchanged in weight, if not in detail. Attention shifted further inward, toward reflection without indulgence. Regret was acknowledged silently, ambition released without ceremony. The role had consumed a lifetime, leaving little space to imagine alternatives. Outside the palace walls, life continued to evolve, but its movement reached royalty only in muted tones. News arrived, filtered, and softened, its urgency reduced by distance and delay. The court absorbed each development carefully, choosing caution over reaction. Time remained slow enough to allow adjustment without alarm. As the end of a reign approached, death itself was treated as another transition rather than an interruption. Preparations were made discreetly, rituals rehearsed, and authority positioned to continue seamlessly. Grief, when it came, followed prescribed forms, contained and dignified. The institution moved forward, as it always had, carrying the crown onward to its next bearer. Medieval royalty understood this inevitability better than anyone. Their lives had been shaped by continuity, sustained by repetition, and guided by acceptance. And so, as the medieval era continued its quiet closing, rulers lived not in anticipation of endings, but in coexistence with them. Their days passed slowly, predictably, and without urgency, resting gently within the long flow of history, patient enough to fade without resistance, and calm enough to allow the story to keep moving, one unhurried step at a time. As the centuries unfolded toward the late medieval period, rulers increasingly became aware of the subtle layers that governed their authority. Power was no longer solely personal. It had become entwined with laws, customs, and traditions that were older than any living monarch. Even the most forceful king or queen had to respect the invisible structures that persisted through decades and generations. The crown no longer symbolized just immediate control. It represented continuity, endurance, and the unbroken expectation that the line of succession would be maintained. Days passed with the same carefully measured rhythm. Audiences were held in stone halls, petitions considered, disputes mediated, yet always within boundaries so well established that novelty felt risky. Decisions were deliberate, tempered by habit and precedent, and often revisited multiple times before any action was taken. Mistakes were not forgotten, but absorbed into routine, minimizing their shock. The palace itself became a mirror of this quiet persistence. Corridors echoed with footsteps that had walked them for decades. Chambers remained largely unchanged, reminding occupants that their role, and the expectations attached to it, were consistent across time. Advisors and courtiers moved through these spaces with practiced familiarity, their own behavior shaped by decades of repetition. Nothing happened suddenly. Even emergencies were absorbed into procedure. An illness, a threatened rebellion, or a dispute among nobles triggered careful consultation and slow adjustment rather than immediate, unmeasured action. Rulers grew adept at managing uncertainty without visible strain, cultivating calm appearances while private thoughts measured risks continually. Marriage remained a tool of statecraft rather than personal connection. Heirs were raised deliberately, educated to anticipate duty more than desire, to inherit patience alongside crowns and lands. The emotional world of the ruler was subdued, contained within carefully controlled gestures, brief words, and cautious expressions. Affection existed, but it was disciplined. Joy and grief were both expressed with an economy of movement, never excessive, always measured. Even entertainment was performed within constraints. Music, storytelling, and games served to reinforce hierarchy and decorum rather than provide release. Time itself had a different quality inside these walls. Days repeated, years accumulated, and life moved more in cycles than in leaps. Successes and failures blurred into continuity. Fatigue became a constant companion, endurance the measure of capability, and repetition the tool of survival. Religion and ritual provided subtle structure, framing events within familiar narratives that offered reassurance without requiring immediate solutions. Prayer, confession, and ceremony marked the passage of time quietly, anchoring rulers to a rhythm that was predictable and calming. Awareness of mortality grew steadily with age, but it was approached pragmatically. Preparations for succession were orderly, inevitable, and largely silent, leaving the institution intact even as individuals faded. In this environment, medieval royalty learned the art of coexistence with duty, life, and history. They moved steadily through years, neither seeking glory nor fleeing responsibility, their lives marked by endurance, careful observation, and slow adaptation. And as the centuries quietly continued their course, the ruler's existence became inseparable from the continuity of the crown itself, allowing history to flow steadily forward, gentle, measured, and unhurried, like a slow river carrying everything along with it. As the late medieval period stretched onward, the distinction between personal desire and royal duty blurred almost entirely. A king or queen rarely acted for themselves. Most movement was shaped by precedent, expectation, or necessity. Even leisure was calculated. Hunting was practiced not only for sport, but for the symbolic demonstration of control. Feasts, music, and games were not purely for enjoyment. They reinforced hierarchy, ritual, and social order. Over time, the repetition of these patterns made life predictable, which in turn created a strange kind of calm. Mistakes were absorbed into history, rarely catastrophic if they could be mitigated with the tools of custom, ceremony, or strategic patience. The court itself became a living record of accumulated experience. Advisors, servants, and junior nobles understood the routines intimately, repeating gestures and responses learned over decades. Change arrived slowly and quietly, filtered through multiple layers of mediation and habit, often disguised as adherence to tradition. This slow rhythm affected perception. What seemed urgent outside the palace often arrived inside as a muted echo, interpreted cautiously, responded to minimally, and absorbed over time. Even rebellions or sieges, when they occurred, followed expected shapes, and rulers could navigate them using accumulated knowledge rather than improvisation. Royal life, though outwardly structured, required constant attention to subtlety. Gestures, tone, and timing communicated as much as formal decrees. Silence could carry warning, patience could carry authority, and a single carefully chosen word could reshape expectations for weeks. Education reinforced this careful mindset. Heirs were taught observation, endurance, and control more than action. They learned the slow calculus of survival in a world that demanded patience over brilliance. Marriage continued to function as political tool, and emotional restraint was expected in every personal interaction. Queens often exercised influence indirectly through correspondence, patronage, and household management, mastering power without attracting overt attention. Aging rulers experienced life as an accumulation of careful choices, routine survival, and measured observation. Time passed predictably, yet with constant underlying pressure to maintain stability. Responsibilities never ceased, and the crown itself felt heavier with each passing decade, a constant companion, reminding the ruler of obligation and continuity. Even death, when it approached, was managed with ceremony, structure, and expectation rather than surprise. Preparations ensured the institution endured beyond the individual, providing reassurance for the court and subjects alike. Religion continued to mark the flow of time, offering rhythm, explanation, and calm. Prayer and ritual became second nature, performed for habit as much as for devotion. And so, the lives of medieval rulers unfolded in a long, measured arc, neither dramatic nor leisurely, but continuous, disciplined, and quietly enduring, allowing both crown and court to persist steadily, almost imperceptibly, through the slow passage of centuries, inviting us to follow along with the same unhurried pace. As the medieval era drew nearer to its final chapters, rulers had long accepted that life consisted more of endurance than triumph. Days passed with familiar rhythm. Audiences, correspondence, ceremonies, meals, and brief periods of observation, all performed in carefully measured sequence. Sudden events, when they arose, were tempered by precedent rather than panic. A threatened rebellion, a diplomatic quarrel, or a minor illness was interpreted through the lens of experience, absorbed slowly, and addressed with minimal disruption. Even joy was muted and structured, expressed formally to signal stability rather than pleasure. Royal identity became inseparable from routine, as the crown shaped thought, speech, and gesture into a continuous performance. Advisors, courtiers, and heirs learned the same measured behaviors, creating a court where expectation and habit dominated daily life. The outside world shifted, with towns growing, trade expanding, and ideas circulating more widely. But these changes arrived, filtered, softened by distance and tradition. Royalty incorporated novelty quietly, often disguising innovation as continuity. Time moved slowly, allowing adaptation but discouraging rash action. The weight of responsibility remained constant, pressing on every decision, every gesture, and even every pause. Aging rulers focused increasingly on succession, stability, and the careful management of records, ensuring that their absence would not disturb the institution they had maintained. Emotional restraint persisted, as affection, grief, or pleasure were tempered by decorum, hierarchy, and expectation. Even private spaces carried ritual. Prayers, reflection, and measured interaction with family or advisors formed a framework within which all life was conducted. Physical discomfort, fatigue, and illness were endured silently, as acknowledgement might weaken authority. Yet within this carefully controlled existence, there was a strange stability, predictable days, repeated procedures, and the quiet knowledge that life had always been structured this way provided reassurance both to rulers and to those around them. Medieval royalty existed within these boundaries for decades, often never questioning them, living lives shaped more by repetition than innovation, more by preservation than ambition. And as the centuries continued to unfold, the crown remained a constant, heavy but familiar, guiding the flow of governance steadily onward. Life moved slowly, predictably, and quietly, offering continuity, endurance, and the comforting sense that, in this long, measured history, no sudden shift would disrupt the carefully maintained rhythm of rule. As the medieval era neared its close, rulers had long internalized the rhythm of life shaped by expectation, routine, and continuity. Each day began and ended with carefully measured activities: ceremonial audiences, review of documents, prayer, observation of protocol, and occasional consultation with advisors who themselves moved predictably within the court. Emergencies were absorbed slowly, handled with deliberation rather than urgency, and resolved through precedent whenever possible. Joy and grief were measured and public, constrained by decorum and hierarchy. Even private reflection was disciplined, performed quietly, and within established boundaries. The crown continued to define identity, its weight both literal and symbolic pressing on every thought, gesture, and decision. Heirs were raised to expect the same cycles, trained in patience, endurance, and careful observation, rather than ambition or improvisation. Advisors guided cautiously, speaking in tempered tones, aware that abrupt action or overt emotion could destabilize the delicate balance of authority. The palace itself reflected this stability. Corridors unchanged, chambers familiar, objects repaired and reused rather than replaced, each stone and tapestry silently reminding occupants of continuity. Time passed slowly, each day folding neatly into the next. The past ever present in ritual and precedent, the future anticipated quietly rather than reshaped dramatically. Political shifts arrived softened, rumors filtered through layers of observation, and decisions were rarely made without careful consultation. Life was endurance measured in small actions, repetition, and the quiet management of perception. Religion, ritual, and tradition provided structure, offering reassurance that the crown, the institution, and the world would continue unchanged, even as individual rulers aged or passed away. As death approached, it was not a sudden rupture but a carefully managed transition. Documents prepared, instructions clarified, heirs positioned, and ceremonies rehearsed. Authority flowed onward, absorbed seamlessly by the next generation. Through all of this, medieval royalty lived within a framework of continuity rather than innovation, expectation rather than excitement, and measured endurance rather than dramatic triumph. Their days, months, and years unfolded slowly, predictably, and quietly, echoing the rhythm of centuries themselves. And so, in the long, patient march of medieval history, rulers endured, maintained, and observed, steady, restrained, and ever so slightly weary, allowing the story of crowns, stone halls, and careful governance to flow gently onward, uninterrupted, and quietly, like a river that never hurries. As the medieval centuries drew toward their final quiet movements, royalty had grown accustomed to the weight of expectation pressing steadily from every direction. Days were long but predictable, filled with repetition rather than excitement, and rulers found comfort in the constancy of routine. Ceremonies, audiences, and correspondence continued much as they always had, each action shaped by precedent and observed with care by those around them. Decisions were deliberate, measured, and often revisited before execution, for mistakes were absorbed into memory, but never entirely forgotten. Heirs were instructed patiently, in the practices of endurance, observation, and subtle influence, ensuring continuity rather than innovation. The court itself acted as a stabilizing mechanism. Courtiers, advisors, and servants moved according to familiar patterns, repeating gestures learned over decades, preserving the rhythm of rule. Outside events, trade, diplomacy, minor unrest arrived softened by distance and time, rarely demanding abrupt action. Rulers learned to manage uncertainty with patience, relying on routine, ritual, and the carefully calibrated performance of authority. Emotional expression remained disciplined. Grief, joy, and satisfaction were measured to reinforce legitimacy, never indulged. The palace became both a home and a container for continuity, stone walls and familiar chambers echoing with repetition and habit. Religion and ceremonial practice marked time, offering a slow, consistent rhythm that bound rulers to both faith and duty. Aging brought perspective rather than release. Attention shifted toward succession, record-keeping, and ensuring the institution outlasted any single life. Even death was handled as a carefully managed transition, reinforcing the crown's stability and the perception of enduring authority. Life for medieval rulers had become a continuous exercise in endurance, observation, and cautious management. Triumph and disaster alike were filtered through ritual and habit, producing a slow, measured existence that emphasized stability above all else. And so, through the long, unhurried centuries, kings and queens persisted quietly, their lives unfolding at the pace of stone, parchment, and ceremony, carrying forward an institution built to endure beyond the individual, steady, restrained, and patiently awaiting the next chapter of history. By the end of the medieval era, royalty had fully embodied the rhythm of continuity, endurance, and careful observation. The crown remained heavy but familiar, guiding rulers through days shaped more by routine than drama. Ceremonies, audiences, correspondence, and councils followed patterns so ingrained that novelty itself seemed almost foreign. Even when crises arose, rebellions, disputes, or illness, they were absorbed slowly, handled with precedent, and rarely interrupted the slow, steady flow of court life. Advisors moved predictably, heirs were trained meticulously, and courtiers repeated gestures learned over decades, all sustaining the stability of the institution. Emotional expression remained measured, even private reflection disciplined, as personal desire was subordinated to duty. Meals, prayer, ritual, and observation filled the day, while stone walls, familiar chambers, and repaired objects quietly reinforced continuity. Aging brought attention to succession, legacy, and the careful management of records, ensuring the crown and court could endure beyond any one life. Even death was ritualized, allowing the institution to persist without disruption. Across the centuries, medieval royalty lived in an unbroken pattern of endurance, subtle management, and repetition, rarely seeking triumph, never pursuing ease, and always maintaining authority through patient consistency. Their lives, though outwardly adorned with crowns, ceremonies, and inherited titles, were in truth long exercises in survival, observation, and measured action, carried forward quietly, without hurry, as if the centuries themselves had agreed to move slowly, leaving the story of medieval kings and queens gently unfolding, uninterrupted, calm, and endlessly patient, precisely the kind of quiet history to fall asleep to.